Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started in just a minute. So in the meantime, get comfortable. Really excited for our session today. I'm going to continue to just chat here for another minute while folks trickle in from the waiting room, just so everybody knows that they are in the right place. We will be getting started very soon. But in the meantime, super excited to have you here. Welcome, and I hope you're having a beautiful Wednesday so far. We are going to be getting started in just about 30 seconds, just letting folks trickle in from the waiting room. And in the meantime, super happy to have you here. We will kick off shortly. I am seeing people trickling in here. And I think maybe we can go ahead and kick off. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that I can chat directly with you and everybody here. Hello, everybody. My name is Brinton Botkin. I use she, her pronouns, and I lead student marketing here at Handshake. So I'm really, really excited to have you here. I know that it is a busy time of year, so really appreciate you giving us your attention and your energy. So excited to welcome you today. Want to do a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started with our session. We're going to have about 30 minutes of discussion, and then we'll save 10 minutes at the end for questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen throughout the session, and we will do our best to get to as many of those as we can. If we happen to move pretty quickly, we'll have even more time for Q&A, so make sure you submit yours. With that, I'm so excited to be here because I, like many of you, absolutely hate job interviews. They're stressful, they're confusing. I always seem to say the wrong thing. And I know this feeling is not unique to me. So if you are in the middle of fall recruitment season and you're feeling maybe extra stressed about interviewing, it's understandable. And with that in mind, we have an expert for you today, a career coach who literally wrote the book on interviewing, who's here to chat about the do's and don'ts of job interviews. So Sam, can you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Of course. Yeah. Thanks, Brenton. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. All 194 of you and growing. Uh, it's great to be here with you. I am with you in that I assume many of you hate job interviews. I used to hate job interviews. I think it's something that most people naturally hate. But what I noticed is in my career is that you can turn that hatred to love. I mean, job interviewing is kind of like going to the dentist or doing your taxes, something that's kind of a necessary evil. But job interviewing is something you can grow to love, and because you can grow to be really good at it. The dentist, unfortunately, I think stays the same, but job interviewing you can learn to love. So just a little bit about me. I've been in the food business a long time. I got my MBA and then went and worked for ConAgra Foods, which is like Healthy Choice and Marie Callender's, all in marketing and brand management. And then I went to work for the Dannon Yogurt Company for a while, which was kind of more, I managed their natural portfolio, Silk Almond Milk and Horizon Organic Milk. And now I've gone the other way. I work for actually a slushy company, funny enough. So you can see in the background, these are called Frazzle slushies. So we're in 22,000 gas stations across the country, a little over 30,000 machines, and I run the marketing for them, which begs the question, why am I talking about job interviewing? Why did I write a book about job interviewing? So I got involved in recruiting in some of these big companies and noticed all the stress and anxiety that is associated with this on both sides, right? And started to see kind of what was working, what wasn't. I had my own experience of botching interviews in business school and my own learning. And then when I got involved in recruiting, I saw what was working out, what wasn't with companies and with candidates, and wound up writing a first book, which was called The 8 Career Skills You Didn't Learn in College, which had a bunch of different things that you don't learn in school, but that really do matter in a career. And that book was fine. But then I thought, wow, all the energy of this book is around one of the chapters, which was called Evolving, which was about resumes and job interviews and stuff. And that's where a lot of the heat and interest of that book came in. And so then I started just taking on clients who would come to me, sometimes just frustrated, sometimes angry, sometimes in tears even, about job interviewing. And
Yeah.
I found it just an absolute joy to go from I don't know what to do to I actually feel really confident in this interview. I feel great. And so I started doing that. And I thought, I think there's potentially an opportunity to take this chapter, blow it out a little bit, turn it into a book. And that's when HarperCollins came along and I pitched the book and they picked it up and the rest is history.
Amazing. I appreciate the background. And I'm glad that you shared a little bit about your career too, because somebody might think you might just have really specific interior decor taste with the
Yeah,
background.
that's right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Awesome. Really, really excited to chat with you today. I think, your experience on the interviewee side, but also the interviewer side is something that's really important for our students and job seekers who are here today, who are kind of potentially maybe in their first interview process, or
Yeah.
they're quite experienced, but they just feel like they're missing the mark. And I think we would benefit maybe before we get into some of the do's and don'ts that we're going to talk about later.
Yeah.
Maybe we can go through some of the basics. So can you share a quick overview of the different types of interviews that early career professionals or career transitioners who are in the interview process might see
Yeah.
for, in their interview process for an internship or a post-grad job?
Sure. A very typical interview will usually start with what I call an introductory question, which sounds something like, so tell me about yourself, or walk me through your resume, or why do you want to work here? Or sometimes they say all three. But it's basically an introductory question, which is your opportunity to give what I call your opening statement, which is just kind of immediately hit them with the right things. And we could talk more about that. But there'll be an introductory question, and then it'll likely be followed by a handful of behavioral questions. And these are the questions that sound like, uh, tell me about a time when. And they're asking you to give them a specific example in your prior experience, school or work, of when you demonstrated a certain skill. And the theory behind this is that if you can specifically demonstrate that you exhibited a skill in the past, you're highly likely to exhibit that skill in the future. That's where the behavioral question comes in. And then sometimes they end there, but if they want to get a little bit harder, then they'll probably throw in like a scenario question. And this could look something like, how would you approach your first 90 days on the job? Or I'm in marketing. Suppose you're the brand manager of this brand. How would you go about trying to grow it? So they'll give you like an open-ended question. This is the one that freaks people out because rather than preparing a specific story, you're now asked to kind of walk through your thinking in real time. So there's no way to 100% prepare it, but there's definitely frameworks you can use and definitely ways to practice this and make sure that, okay, no matter what question I'm asked, I kind of have a model I can use to kind of get through it. And then they may ask some questions about you. I just call them you questions, like, tell me about your leadership style, or what kind of leader are you? So this is kind of the flip of, tell me about a time when you demonstrated leadership. They'll just say, what kind of leader are you? Which, a trick to that is you can pretty much spin your story that you have, a behavioral story you have, you can spin that into answering those questions. And then they'll likely close and say, do you have any questions for me? Which is an opportunity for you to ask relevant questions that that person is uniquely qualified to answer. That's typically what you'll see. If you prepare for all those questions, you likely won't get them all, but you'll be prepared for them all. That's typically what you'll see.
Awesome. And we're already getting some questions in the Q&A. I think we'll probably
Yeah.
circle back to particularly that last note that you mentioned about questions that you have for the interviewer. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that away for later during the Q&A
Sure,
section.
sure.
I want to transition into, in your book,
Yeah.
Hate Job Interviews, which
Yes.
aptly titled, you talk about embracing the suck and how your advice about interview prep is not always popular among college students you talk to, because obviously everybody's pressed for time, but particularly when you're in college, you're juggling classes, social life, job search, all of the
Yeah.
obligations, potentially part-time work or full-time work. It can be really challenging to make
Yeah.
that space for interview prep. Can you talk a little bit more about the concept of embracing the suck and why it's
Yes, for
essential for
sure.
preparing?
Yeah. So the most common question I get if I'll speak at colleges or whatever, usually will say, what can I do to really stand out? What's the one thing I can do to stand out in an interview? And I'm like, I'm sorry, you're not going to like this answer, but the one thing is everything. You just have to, there's just no shortcut to just absolutely preparing in such a way that you'll crush it. So when I say embrace the suck, it's really about doing things you don't like to do. Like 10 hours of working out feels very different than 10 hours from 10 hours of watching Netflix, right? Because working out sucks. And I think it's the same thing with job interviewing. It's kind of like, oh man, this is already something I don't like doing. And so now you just kind of have to be a little bit of a glutton for punishment to go through that thing you don't want to do. And it could be a specific part of job interviewing. For me, for a while, it was the scenario like case question. I'd prepare and I'd nail the introductory question in practice. I'd nail the behavioral question, but I would kind of avoid practicing the behavior or the case question because I just didn't like it. And so the more you can just kind of face that, it's kind of a painful process. I recommend, by the way, 10 hours of preparation per job interview, which already kind of sucks. I mean, that's not great. But I mean, think about it this way. The investment of 10 hours of time so that you can be the absolute best you can be for something that could dictate really how you spend the rest of your life, 8 hours a day plus the rest of your life is a pretty good investment. I mean, my kids, they'll go to football practice for like, 10 hours and they might not even play in high school. It might not go anywhere. So we'll do all sorts of stuff for 10 hours, but 10 hours of diligent interview practice, yes, can kind of suck, but it also can make you really good. And when you're really good, then on the other side of that, you start to love job interviews and then you get the job you want. So that's what that concept is.
I love that. And I'm gonna put on my
Yeah.
handshake hat here and just encourage too for folks who are in the audience who might still be in school and still have access to your school's career center. That's a really great place to get some of that practice in and that prep for your interviews in is your school's career center. You have tons of professionals who are there who can support you with mock interviews and interview prep, potentially some background on some of the companies you're going to be interviewing for or meeting at a career fair. So I'll step off my little handshake soapbox
That's
there.
great. They're great resources. I mean, practicing is the number one thing. I mean, when
Yes.
I work with clients, the difference between the first mock interview I do and the second and third is
Mhm.
night and day. If you've never done a mock interview,
Yeah.
uh, I promise it's worth it. I know it's like, oh, well, I don't know. I think I got it. I think I
Mhm.
got it. I've prepared or whatever. And then once you get into the interview and you start speaking, you think to yourself, oh no,
Yeah.
it's like Hitch, the movie Hitch, where he's like, I saw that coming out differently in my mind. Exactly
Yeah.
what it's like. You start to speak and you think, oh no, I thought this was going to go better than it's going. And it's
Yep.
great to get that stuff out in a practice. So then in the real thing, you've already taken care of it. You've already got it out.
Absolutely. Awesome. So you've talked about embracing the suck. Do you have any other kind of unpopular opinions for our audience when it comes to doing the necessary prep work ahead of interviews? I know you mentioned that 10 hours of prep already kind of sucks. It's a big investment.
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit more about any unpopular opinions you might have?
sure. There's two things that I most people don't do that I think are critical steps.
Mhm.
The first is in the preparation process. Most of the time, they'll just research the company online and just try to find out what they need to online, which is fine for a small amount of time. The most important thing they could do is start talking to people who know anything about the company. So get on LinkedIn, ask for time. In the book, I mentioned a gentleman, Ivan Boesky, who was like the first inside trader, this huge scandal, lost, made millions, then went to jail. And I encourage the reader to kind of be like this person, not in a financial sense, because you'll go to jail. So don't do inside trading, but inside
Solid advice.
information. Yeah, it's good advice. Don't do inside trading. But inside information in the job interview, if done right, is legal, ethical, and even encouraged many times. So if you find someone that used to work for a company or even currently does that can that you just get on LinkedIn, hey, I see we share an alma mater, friend of a friend, whatever. Can I just take 15 minutes of your time and pick your brain? And you get on the phone, and the things you'll hear will be a wealth of information that will allow you to prepare. I've even had circumstances where I've called someone familiar with the company and I've never asked for it, but they're just like, hey, let me just give you the playbook here. Let me tell you what I know. They just offer things to you because they want to help you. And so in the book, I talk about just how to do that right and how to do it ethically and stuff like that. But shutting down the laptop, picking up the phone, and talking to people will be an invaluable part of your preparation because it'll allow you to anticipate the right questions that are going to be asked so you can develop your answers. So that's one. The other piece is when I talk about this 10 hours is the practice piece. It's just like, okay, I'm going to have my friend, my partner, my spouse read these questions to me and I'm going to try to everything I can to simulate the real thing. And it can feel a little awkward, a little uncomfortable, but it's super valuable. So those are probably the two things. If I would say like, what are the mistakes I see in terms of preparation? There's just one other thing, which is in the behavioral question, candidates often are not specific enough. So when they say, can you tell me about a time when you had to deal with it, when you managed a complex project?
Mhm.
Many times, like a weak answer, someone who's not practiced will say, well, I think it's super important to, manage complex and I'm really good with complexity. I'm really good at breaking problems that are down that are simple. And they'll speak in generalities. But what you want to do is it's almost like you want to show them a movie scene, like press play and take them into a time when you actually did that has a beginning, middle, and end, where you're actually showing them this movie scene, pressing play, watch, and then stop. So you'll say, yeah, there was one time when I was working at, and there's a format for this: SPAR, situation, problem, action, result, but you want to actually walk through exactly what happened. So in the end, they're like, okay, that was irrefutable. There's no way that I can deny that you actually did that thing.
Right.
Versus when you're talking about generalities, they're kind of like, well, he or she says that's the case, but I don't really have any proof. I don't really know for sure because they didn't tell me a specific example with a specific result in the end.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, I want to make sure that we transition into the title of this session, which is job interview do's and don'ts.
Yes.
So I want to make sure we have some space for that before we get into the Q&A. We're getting a lot of really good questions here.
Right.
But I want to get into maybe some cautionary tales. Let's start with the negative and end on the positive.
Yeah. Okay.
When you just mentioned that one of the mistakes that you see is that people are a little bit too vague in their answers and behavioral questions. Are there any other common mistakes that you see during the interview process, especially from folks who are early on in their careers? And I think we might get some questions as well. You talked
Yeah.
about a lack of specificity
Yeah.
for students or people who maybe don't have directly applicable experience professionally. That can be
Yeah.
really challenging. So maybe we can get into some questions around translating school,
Yes. Good.
kind of
Let's
those
let's let's
early.
address that one. That's an
Yeah,
important one that I get a lot. So
yeah.
let's address that one. What do I do when I feel like I don't really have relevant experience, either because I'm career switching or because
Hmm.
I'm in school?
Hmm.
Um, the answer is there's definitely a way to do this. So there's definitely a way. So don't be discouraged.
Yeah.
Um, I think the first thing you have to get comfortable with is when you're interviewing for a job out of school, they know that you're in school.
Yeah.
They know that you don't have work experience. They selected you to interview based on your resume that says you don't have experience, and they know you're in school. When I say don't have experience, hopefully you're doing things like internships and you're trying to, whatever. But it's totally appropriate to talk about your class projects that you did, other life experience that you have that demonstrates the skill. Sometimes when someone says, "Tell me about when you had to work on a complex project," you have to think about, okay, you might say, oh, well, this is a finance job, and I've never done that with finance. You have to take it a level up and say, they're not trying to gauge my financial expertise. They're trying to gauge my ability to think through problems and
Mm-hmm.
be analytical. So you have to take it up a level and then say, okay, well, when have I done that? Oh, well, in this last school project, there was a project we did that was pretty complex. What was my part in that? And then you can craft your story around that. So I call that bridging. It's basically when you take a skill and you translate your skill that may not be directly translatable, but you go up and think through like the higher order skill and you bridge based on the experience you have. What translatable experience do you have? And I know right now many of you are sitting here thinking that's impossible, but it's actually not. If you push yourself, you really can start to craft that and think that if you just take the time to do it. And the same goes with career switching. I'll give you one story. I mentioned this in the book. I have a friend who was trying to get into marketing with like Disney, and he had a PhD in history. And it was like, okay, well, that has nothing to do with it. I mean, on the surface, right? But he gave an answer to the interviewer in his introductory question that said, I know that someone who has a PhD in history does not seem like a direct translation to marketing. However, one of the reasons I'm now studying marketing and now so interested in it is that history is all about the study of people and their behavior and why they behave. And that's what gets me so excited about marketing, because marketing, this part of marketing is the same thing. And so if you can figure out a way to bridge your experiences and show confidence in that, it's it's definitely doable. And if you're confident in it, the interviewer will buy it.
Yeah.
I've bought it as an interviewer many times. The interviewer will buy it.
I love it. And I love naming the thing, right? Not letting a lack of directly applicable experience go unsaid, just
That's right.
acknowledging, hey, you
Right.
might be thinking that I don't have particular experience in this area, but here's why I'm the qualified candidate. I
That's
love
right.
that.
Exactly.
Are there any other don'ts that you would want to touch on,
Sure. Yeah,
before
real
we move
quick.
in? Yeah.
Real quick. So this introductory statement that I mentioned, many people use that as just a warm up. Like, oh, well, yeah, I went to school here and I like to do this. And yeah, okay. Um, that's a mistake. You want your introductory statement when they say, tell me, walk me through your resume. It's game on at that point. You want to walk them through your experiences in such a way where they, by the end, know that you're qualified,
Mhm.
that you're a high performer, and that you really want the job.
Mhm.
And you do that by walking them through your experiences, highlighting like good things that you've done, thinking about the job description and which experiences are most applicable, and then transitioning by saying, and here's how I found this job. Here's what interests me so much about it. And I'm just really excited about this interview. So by after that first question, you have momentum, which is the most important thing you can have, and an inner positive momentum that can carry you through. So the don't waste that introductory question.
Yeah.
You can really make a big impression. I mean, you don't want to just go crazy, but you want it to be clear that you have the experience, you're a high performer, and that you really want this job.
I love it. And, I want to briefly touch too about don'ts on the interviewer's side. In your book, you spend a little bit of time talking about avoiding landmine questions that can range from just like wacky to sus to plain illegal,
Yeah. Yeah.
which hopefully a lot of our audience does not experience in their time interviewing, but it is, it does happen.
Yeah.
How can what advice would you give to somebody who's new to the interviewing process to look out for red flags while they're
Yeah.
mid-interview?
Yeah. This is a very tricky area because sometimes, and it's contextual, because sometimes an interviewer asks an illegal question without really even realizing it. Like, oh, so where were you born? And it's like, oh, can't ask that. But they actually are just an inexperienced interviewer. So you have the option then of saying, oh, I was born in California. And I understand, and just to be clear, I understand this is not as easy for different groups of people. So I want to be sensitive to that. Or you have the option to kind of say, oh, interesting. Yeah. Is there a reason you're asking that? And they might say, oh, yeah, you're right. Whatever. And then there's also the kind of the code red, which is like, that's illegal. Right. And the reason it's kind of a tricky one sometimes is because you have to kind of try to understand why they're asking the question. So on the illegal piece, there's no right answer. It kind of depends on context. Is they're really trying, oh, are you pregnant? I mean, uh, there's a difference between saying, are you pregnant? Because I want to know because I don't know if I want to hire you, which is clearly illegal. And, oh, are you pregnant? Which is like, I actually just am a really inexperienced interview and I'm making small talk and I made a mistake. And that's not easy. That's not easy. But there's no one right answer to that. As far as the wacky questions, there's all sorts of wacky questions. And I think sometimes they just want to see that you can be poised and kind of play along. If you were a spirit animal, what would you be? You know, okay, well, look, I think I would be, whatever, a cocker spaniel, because sometimes I could be a little persistent, but I'm always friendly, whatever. I mean, they're going to ask these weird questions of you. Just do your best to try to tie it back to the job description. I'd be a golden retriever because I'm super loyal. And I think, honestly, I work really well with others. I mean, just tie it back to the job description, bring them back as best you can, and move on. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I lost you.
I was
There you
muted.
go.
That's on me.
Okay, good. All
Sorry.
right, good.
And I was laughing, which is why I muted myself when you were giving some examples of wacky questions. But okay,
Yeah,
I want
yeah.
to move into some do's before we move
Yeah.
into the Q&A because we've gotten a ton of really great questions that I want to make sure we have space for. If you had to put it succinctly, when it comes to interviewing, what takes someone from like average in an interview setting to a great interview?
Okay. Some of the things I talked about, which is this introductory question, um, the stories. Maybe I'll just touch on that a little bit more, and then I'll go to scenario questions. So basically, this SPAR format: situation, problem, action, result. Many of you may have heard of this. There's like CAR or STAR or whatever. SPAR for me is deliberate because I'll tell you why. So this is like usually a 2 to 4 minute answer. Tell me about a time when you had to deal with a difficult coworker, for example. Okay. The S part, the situation, you want that to be pretty quick. You set that up. Yep, in my previous job at Hewlett Packard, I worked on a broad range of teams and I was brought in as a new project manager. Okay, that's your situation. Problem. This is where you don't just want to give a task. You want to give a problem because you want to create drama, just like a movie. You want them to be interested in continuing to listen. So you want to create some sort of tension. One of the team members, when I was brought in, was much more tenured than I, and it was clear from the beginning he was disappointed that I was the leader of the team, and he would do things like deliberately leave me off of emails, and he would make comments, and that was really difficult. And I realized I needed to gain credibility and a good working relationship with this person, or I wasn't going to be successful. Okay, so that's some drama that you can sink your teeth into. You're thinking now, okay, wow, how's this person going to resolve this, right? The action is where you spend most of your time. And I like to do, I call it the rule of threes, but just to give some structure. So let me tell you what I did. The first thing I did was I set up kind of a lunch with him. And I even called it a mentoring lunch because he had been at the company a lot longer and I wanted to learn from him. So I set up a lunch with him and just got to know him personally and learned about a little bit about his life, his professional career, and just built that rapport. Okay, second thing I did was I asked him if he would kind of be an informal mentor for me on this project so that I could show him things. So then we set up a weekly one-on-one, which was great. And the third thing I did was anytime I was about to make a big decision, I would show him first to get his input to make sure that by the time I presented it, he was already supportive and he wouldn't like derail or something like that. So that's your action. You kind of walk them through in sequence what you did. And then, often forgotten, you end with the results. So, and the result usually should be you're a rock star and everything worked out great, just so you know, most of the time. But, and as a result of this, we completed the project on time and on budget. And in the end, this person actually gave me feedback in my 360 review that I was one of the best project leaders that he had ever worked with. Okay, so that's how you want to structure the SPAR format. So that's a do. The other one, and we're not going to have a ton of time to get into the details, but on the scenario question, I just want to mention the biggest fear people have on the scenario question is getting lost. And, all right, tell me how you'd improve the marketing. Well, I think your logo needs improvement. Shoot, where do I go from here? I don't know. I mentioned the first thing that came to my mind. Now I'm kind of in a corner. So there's a model, and I talk about this in the book. It's called the home base model. When someone asks you a scenario question, if you can start with a home base, which is like kind of principle based, then you can just kind of explore options, explore paths without getting lost, because you can always kind of come back to that core principle or that home base. So when someone asks you, what would you do in the first 90 days? One thing you could say is like, I'd really work to fix your inventory system. It's like, okay. Or you could say, I would focus my first, 30 days on building relationships, on making a contribution, and to learning everything I can. Okay, let me start with building relationships. Path. Here's what I do. Come back to home base. Okay, now let me tell you about the second thing I would do. Come back to home base. Now the third thing I would do, come back to home base. So if you can identify, just take a pause and identify like the core principle of what you're trying to say, you're not going to get as lost, and your answer is going to be a lot more it's almost like walking, it's almost like having scaffolding to walk on versus nothing to walk on, if that makes sense. So those are some do's.
Love it. And you answered some of the questions that we've received by going through the SPAR format. We've
Okay.
got a lot of, as soon as you mentioned it, we got a couple of questions saying like,
Yeah.
can you get more into detail there? Because we
Can we
talk a lot
talk
about
about this?
STAR
Yeah.
format, but I think the problem approach is something that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So love that you were able to give a solid example there. Before we get into our Q&A portion, I would love to spend some time on real talk and also address some of the questions that we've gotten so
Okay.
far during the session.
Okay.
Sometimes, like, let's be real, sometimes we don't nail it in an interview. Sometimes it absolutely sucks and we flop a little bit and it happens. Do you have
Yeah.
any advice for somebody who might be feeling demoralized after a bad interview or bad interview streak even, on how to build confidence and bounce back?
Right. I think confidence does come with practice. And I think the only thing you can control is being the best you can be in your interview, right? That's the only thing you can control. Sometimes I've been really prepared, but just like the interviewer, it's just like not a great fit. Just like the interviewers, it's just a little strange. It doesn't kind of work. And that happens, and that's totally fine. I give yourself a break on that. I think what you can do is control how you react to those things and how much you practice for the next one. And so if there's one thing I could tell, I mean, it is real talk. Sometimes it just sucks and you don't get the job. The real talk is every one of you who is really trying to get a job will eventually get a job. Like everyone's going to get a job. 100% of the people who have come to me and been like, I just don't know if this is going to work out, have gotten a job. So you're going to get a job, right? The question is just, what kind of a job is it? How soon will you get it? Sometimes it's just a matter of time. But I would say the one thing that you ought to just focus on is the stuff within your control, which is how prepared are you? How much do you practice? And confidence will come with practice. Some people think confidence is just natural. There's a certain truth to that, but confidence without practice looks like arrogance to an interviewer, right? So confidence with practice is where you want to be. So even if you're naturally confident, if you don't practice, it likely won't come off right.
I love it. I think that's a really great note to transition into some of our Q&A, and you're
All right.
talking practice. So I'm just gonna take us right into a related question there,
Okay, great.
which I think is a really important one to address for this audience. As I mentioned, with college students and recent grads, 10 hours is a lot of time, and it can be challenging to structure that. And we have a question here that says, let's see. You mentioned 10 hours of investment in job interview prep. How should one split up the time in the different phases of preparation? There's preparing
Great.
your responses, there's practicing, there's getting to know more about the company through research. Do you have a recommendation for kind of how to think about that time?
Yes, great question. The first 3 hours is kind of your research and preparation. So you research the company online. Hopefully, you can have a couple of informational interview calls where you ask people, tell me about the company or whatever. And you're kind of really just gathering information. And that usually takes, to do it right, I'd say about 3 hours. You're studying the job description, right? What is the job description telling me about the skills and stuff like that? The next 3 hours is where you're crafting what I call your power examples. And these are when you look at the job description and you take the information that you're hearing about the company, you can kind of start to say, okay, there's there's thousands of questions that I could be asked, okay, which is stressful. But there's only probably 5 to 7 skills that they're trying to assess, right? So the answer for your preparation is not to try to anticipate the answer to 1,000 questions. The answer is try to craft power examples for these 5 to 7 skills. And then you just learn to kind of tweak it based on the question you're asked. Someone might say, how analytical are you? Or tell me about a time where you had to really be analytical, or tell me about a time where you had to solve a problem. You can use the same stuff for all this, right? Politicians do it all the time, right? They have the things they want to say and get across. And then, but the way the question's asked, you just kind of have to get good at spinning it just slightly to tailor it to that answer. So 3 hours is where you're kind of anticipating maybe some questions and just saying, okay, they're looking for someone who is collaborative. Here's a story, here's a power example of where I collaborated really well, right? And then you can kind of turn that into a story, stuff like that. And then 6 hours is where you can kind of spend practicing. And I don't think you need to be doing mock interviews the whole time. In one interview where I practiced for 10 hours, I think it was at least 10 hours, I really wanted the job. A couple of my practice were just on my commute home. I was just reciting answers and telling my story in the car by myself, but just out loud, right? So that definitely qualifies as practice. As a busy person, if you're commuting or if you're doing something like that, you can find ways to practice, as you're working out or whatever, wherever you are. And then I like to have, 1 to 2 ideally mock interviews at the end of that. So it's 3 hours preparation, three to four, like crafting your examples and, in writing your stories, and then 3 to 4 of out loud practice.
Super helpful. I think some of those examples lead me to another kind of, I'm gonna take a couple
Yeah.
of the questions that we've received and try and craft them into one that is,
Yeah.
comprehensive of the theme. But there seems to be a lot of anxiety that I'm seeing in the Q&A about, I haven't had a job yet. I don't have super specific answers for some of these questions, particularly in the behavioral interview. How useful are hypothetical answers, or should I try to find an example from class or from, an extracurricular activity that demonstrates this skill or addresses this particular area that might come up in my interview? Can you talk a little
Great.
bit about that?
Sure. If you're specifically asked, like, tell me about a time when I would not go hypothetical. I would definitely make it about you. And, um, I really feel like someone, let's say, coming out of college or in college that's looking for an internship that is that is interviewing may not have super applicable work experience, of course, but you likely have applicable life experience. So the more you can craft a great story, maybe you were a captain of a sports team, maybe you had a job when you were, younger. I mean, um, you know, so that's one thing. I think you can use these techniques. I think you can make it work. The other thing is, if you don't have a job, working anywhere, I would consider just going and finding something, like get yourself working, not like anything, a campus job, anything that you're doing, and start thinking through how that might be applicable, right? And this is why preparation is so important, is because you can craft the story, and then when you're practicing it, you can kind of be to like the interviewer, like, did that sound stupid? Does that sound stupid? Yeah, it kind of does. If you tweak the wording a little bit, though, it's going to sound a lot better. And so it's the practicing and then going back to the desk and, erasing and writing it. Practice it, go back to the desk, and you just keep iterating until you have a story. Well, hey, actually, you were a lifeguard at a pool, but you actually did a great job of demonstrating how you were a leader, based on the preparation and the way you structured that story. Dang, I'm actually really impressed. So there's a way to do it. I know there is, but this is why getting into the weeds and the practice is so important.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to do another question that is indicative of a larger flavor of several that we've gotten.
Yeah.
Bad interviewers. If
Yeah.
you are in an interview and somebody is just putting off energy that you don't vibe with, maybe they are just refusing to kind of meet your energy, maybe very
Yep.
serious, very like one word answers. Do you have any advice for how to deal with a situation where it just seems like maybe the interviewer is not meeting your energy?
Yes. Yeah, totally. Okay. So a couple things. Number one, you might be doing much better than you think. I remember I used to have a boss who was kind of She could be come off as cold. And I remember I was looking to hire someone who I really liked. My boss interviewed that person. That person went in. So my boss said, that person's great. We should hire her. What I didn't know is that person went into the car. Her husband picked her up. She immediately burst into tears and she said, I blew it. That interviewer did not like me at all. This didn't work at all. And then she got a job offer, right? So I think sometimes you're doing better than you think. It's hard to know. Sometimes interviewers are preoccupied or busy or just not great, at giving interviews. So that's one thing to know. The other thing is there are some things you can influence and control in the interview. Like if someone says like, so are you a leader? That's kind of a weird question because you want to say, well, yes, I am, but that's not a great answer. You feel weird saying, yes, I am. But you want to say, well, yeah, I'm happy to give you, if I can, would it be okay if I gave you an example of how I've demonstrated leadership? And they're like, yeah, sure. I mean, they're like, I'm a terrible interviewer. Of course I'm going to say yes. So there are ways that I think you can kind of take control of the interviewer if they're not kind of doing a great job, where you can suggest things and they'll usually go along with it. If they don't really know what they're doing, they'll go along with it and you can kind of spoon feed it to them. That doesn't solve all the problems. Sometimes, and I've been in the situation, it's like, well, yep, that wasn't my day. That was weird. But guess what? I've gotten really good at this. So the likelihood of the next three being weird, very low. The likelihood of me getting one in the next three, very high. Very high that I'll get an offer from the next three.
Love it. Okay, I want to try to get a couple more questions in before we wrap.
Sure. Yeah.
A couple of questions have come through about your home base answer example.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about how to identify kind of a home base answer and where that particular tip comes in handy for somebody who's an
Yeah. Yeah. Um, the home base, really what it is, it's kind of like, well, what's a good home base? How do I come up with a good home base? It comes through practice. But the other thing I'll say is sometimes when someone asks you a question and your brain is thinking, oh no, how do I answer this? The inclination sometimes is to start talking and kind of almost rambling, right? Whereas you want to train yourself to actually say, oh, let me just think about that, you know? And then you can step back and think about what a good home base is. A home base is basically like when you think let's think about marketing just for a second. That's my world. How would you improve our marketing? Okay. What ideas do you have to your marketing? Your brain might be going a lot of places. Oh, I think your social media needs to be better, or your Facebook ads aren't good, all right? That's a path, right? But you want to think about, I would, what's something that's a little bit higher up? Okay. Um, what I would focus on, ways I would improve, I'd think about ways to improve my relationship with my consumer. And I think there's a few ways to do that. So you're rooted in the consumer and what the consumer wants. Now, let me talk to you about some thoughts on social media. Let me talk to you, okay, you don't have to have all these answers in your mind yet. You just know it's the consumer, and that gives you time to think. Okay, now what else about my product? Yeah, I want to know, I want to think through how my product is doing and ways I can improve my product experience for the consumer. Okay, what else? Oh, my retailers, the way the consumers see it at the retailer. Yeah, I can think about how to better work with the retailer. So if you go back to the consumer, that's your home base. And then you can springboard off of that. It takes a little time to develop that gut. It takes a little time, but the one thing I would say is you practice it, you'll get better. And also, when someone asks you a hypothetical, you can ask for like 15 to 20 seconds to just think it through so you can pick a good home base. Because once you pick a good one, then you're in much better shape than if you just immediately start talking.
Yep, that answers another question that I had seen is it okay to ask for a little bit of time before I answer a
Absolutely.
question? So great way to weave that in. I know we
Yeah.
are at the end of our time. I do want to end with a couple of questions about the ending. Is that okay? Do you have a
Yeah, of
minute
course. Of
to answer a couple more?
course.
So at the end of an interview,
Yeah.
oftentimes you are asked, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of questions that might be good for somebody earlier on in their career to ask the
Yeah.
interviewer at the end of their session?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's extremes. You don't want to ask something that just you're only asking to try to look smart. And you don't want to ask something that is like something you ask after you have the offer, like, hey, how much money can I make here? So you want to do something that is the person's uniquely qualified to answer and something that you're genuinely interested in. Like, tell me about the culture here. What are the things you're most excited about in the next couple of years in this department? What do your highest performers look like? Those are things that they're uniquely qualified to answer that you can have genuine interest in that will foster a good conversation.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's great. And then finally, we're not going to be able to get to every question. I'm so sorry to everybody who asked a question that we don't have time for
Find
today.
me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
LinkedIn is where I'm at. So if you have questions, find me on LinkedIn. Let's connect.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So is it okay to ask the interviewer if they have any feedback for you at the end of the interview? Is
I
that
think so.
appropriate?
I think depending on how the interview goes, I think it can be important to say, is there anything that I haven't clarified for you that I can clarify now? To like, look, you reiterate your interest. Thanks so much for this time. I'm so excited about this opportunity, really. Is there anything that I can clarify for you or questions you still have that I haven't answered for you? Totally appropriate to do that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sam. I am sharing my screen here that has a QR code for folks who
Ooh,
are
where does
interested
this even go? I'm gonna scan it. Yeah.
This is to buy your book with an
Okay, great.
exclusive discount code.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Sam, for sharing your expertise with us. This has been such a fabulous session. For everybody who has joined us today, be sure to come back and look at more Handshake events. Be sure to keep up with Sam. You can pick up this book with an exclusive discount code for the next week and get all types of interview advice from Sam. So thank you very much. And I'm so excited to have had you here. So thank you,
Thank
thank you,
you.
thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. Very kind of you to join.
Thank you. Have a great one, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.